But that's, I think, where data typically fails a lot, just in the disbursement of it within an organization. And the bigger you are, the harder it is. But even in a small business, 5 people, 10 people, it's the same idea. Who's actually owning the Shopify data or the Google Analytics data, who's making sure it's accurate, and who's able to explain what's going on.
Welcome to the Winning E-commerce Experience Show. And now your host, Shahram Anver.
Hey guys, great to have you back. Our guest today is a data strategist that helps companies find the hidden gems within their data. Ruben Ugarte, great to have you on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, you were telling me that you're calling in from Vancouver, and things are pretty chill over there compared to the craziness that's happening everywhere else.
Yeah, I think I guess we started a little bit earlier than I guess parts of the US and so on, but we're not doing too bad. We have a lockdown like most people, but it's progressing in an optimistic way so far.
That's good. That's good. And from what I've been reading, you're a data guy, right? So it seems like the numbers are making you. I mean, it's obviously something worrying, but at least maybe the numbers aren't as bad in Canada as it is in some other parts of the world.
Yeah, and I actually wrote about this in terms of trying to think through the numbers because I saw a lot of confusion among my friends and my family and even with clients. And I think I was trying to focus on saying, total cases will always go up. It's not a good metric, but instead here are a couple other metrics that I think are much better, and governments might report on that. And I think that was helpful for me and some of my close friends to not completely, get confused by the numbers, but look at really what's the actual trend underneath the trend.
Yeah, honestly, I don't want to go into specifics on this like healthcare numbers because I don't want anybody listening in like trying to think of that as advice. But it did make me think when I was looking at those numbers because I'm a data guy as well, that kind of like the data literacy part of like things is so important, right? Like it seems like it's something which it's shocking how few people can look at a number and truly make sense of it or try to apply some kind of heuristic behind it and think like, does this number make sense, right? So even a percentage, like especially with like clickbait media and things like that, you can really take a number and make it do whatever you want. And if someone's not really thinking a little bit behind, like, hey, how did that number come about? It can lead to some very dangerous conclusions.
Yeah. I've always seen context as being really important in any kind of conversation around data or numbers. And it was really critical, even in news. I would see a news article and it'd be like, oh, X amount of people did this or this happened. But then that's the headline. But then you read like the first paragraph and you find out the context of, well, capacity is much slower. So even though it's 100% capacity, it's still only 20% capacity of what it could be. There was an example here with transportation. We have like ferries that go to the island. So I remember just seeing that people weren't really getting the context behind numbers or stories. And it was just the one headline, the one number, and that was what they were basing arguments on or deciding what to do or not to do.
Yeah. And I mean, I think the area which we're both passionate about is business. And I mean, arguably, data plays such a huge role in business that I'd say it's sort of something like a must do kind of education, right? To really understand if you're looking at a number, what's the context? Like with e-commerce, I think you get so many numbers thrown at you, right? Like average order value, conversion rate, number of impressions. How do I compare? So for instance, something really basic, like I've seen this happen a lot where people would say, look, my conversion rate this month is higher than it was last month. But that doesn't tell you much at all because this month could have totally different things that's happening than last month. So maybe it's actually worse because everybody else is doing so much better this month versus last month. Have you, so, like in your experience, like, have you, like when you're talking to clients, is there sort of this sort of a bit of a reset that you find that you have to do, where you sort of say, hang on, actually, let me just explain the context behind the numbers, and it's not correct what you guys are doing? Or like, how do you find this?
Yeah. I used to think when I started doing this 5 years ago that it was a technical problem.
Right.
They weren't able to collect the data. They couldn't find the right tools or maybe the people to help them. And those are there uh, in some scale, but I actually really now think the biggest problem for companies is not that they can't collect the data they need or don't have access to it, is they actually just don't know how to read it,
Mm.
um, and they don't know how to process it. And I work mostly with marketing teams, product teams, which means I'm working usually with non-technical folks, and the way we
Mm-hmm.
we would describe them as non-engineers. So they see numbers like what you mentioned, and it just either seems right or it doesn't seem right, but it's all very kind of blurry. It's kind of almost like a gut feeling on how to process numbers. And I find myself doing a lot of work with clients, simply trying to explain how to read numbers, what's the best way to go about it, what's the best way to choose KPIs, and just a lot of training in that area.
So, what's the biggest mistake that you see people making in this? I know that's a very broad question, so
Yeah.
I can be a little bit more specific, but I'll just let you take it for now.
Biggest mistake, I would say it comes down to the proper strategy.
Mm-hmm.
And companies will typically do, they'll choose tools. They know why they need data. I always say that data doesn't need a pitch deck. You don't need to work very hard to get people to say yes to it.
Yeah.
But they don't follow through, and they don't think about how it's actually going to be used in the day to day.
Mm.
So that means, some companies might have data science teams, which is great. Someone can own it. But if they don't, who's going to own it? Who's going to take care of it? Who's going to go out and explain it? Who's going to go and teach it? Who's going to go and train people? All those things about how the data will actually get used. And they're
Mm-hmm.
typically people problems. Just who's going to
Mm.
do this? Who's going to do something in an organization that's already busy? No
Mm-hmm.
one has spare time to just do all those things. But that's, I think, where data typically fails a lot, just in the disbursement of it within an organization. And the bigger you are, the harder it is. But even in a small business, 5 people, 10 people, it's the same idea. Who's actually owning the Shopify data or the Google Analytics data, who's making sure it's accurate, and who's able to explain what's going on.
Right. And I guess you always have this, when I asked you that question, I had something else in mind, that what I thought maybe could have been the biggest mistake. I find that you have this fallacy where people read data to tell them what they want to hear.
Yes. Yeah.
Right. Like, I don't know if I expressed that correctly, but it sounds like you got it. Like, essentially, it's like, I want to believe that this is true. So I'm going to and it's sort of like, at least when I have conversations, I think it's related to what you were saying, but essentially like a people problem. It's a bit like, okay, just step away from your gut, completely. Like, obviously, I think having a hypothesis makes sense, but like, if the data is saying that, um, you know, if you're not getting a complete enough picture with the data, then you risk just cherry picking the ones that make your point look even better, and then you just keep going down the wrong path, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I seen this. I remember I had a client once that had very poor retention, and we were looking mostly at acquisition.
Mm-hmm.
And we had the data to back up the poor retention, but they just wouldn't focus on it. And I was really confused why.
Mm-hmm.
And eventually I learned, one of the reasons why they were avoiding it was because they actually didn't know how to deal with it, how to tackle the retention problem.
Right.
They didn't have the capacity to change the product or really spend a lot of time in it. So they were just effectively avoiding it. But I've seen that a lot, especially with someone who maybe doesn't have data and they have a napkin math understanding of what's going on. They might think, yeah, right now we convert roughly at 5%. At some point they made the sort of the math in their head. And then you give them data and maybe the conversion rate is 2%. Their initial reaction will be, this is obviously off because we've been
Right.
at 5% for 2 years.
Mm-hmm.
with no data, but we've been there. So yes, I could see the data doesn't, it doesn't prove, it doesn't prove or disprove. It just sort of supports whatever you want it to support.
Yes, and I guess that's where it gets tricky. But let's bring it down to small business e-commerce for a second, right? Or maybe a little bit more than a second. Um, let's say, like when you talk to a client who they've got very unique problems, right? So let's start with that. So I think most of the stuff you read online happens to be examples with very well-known companies. You notice how there are stories like how Google improved their conversion rate by changing the color of a button.
Yeah, yeah.
How Amazon did X, Y, and Z because of all the data they had. But one thing for sure is that these guys are just machines at collecting data and analyzing it and doing, making very good business decisions based on that. But when you bring it down to a small business, you have, I think, a host of problems. One is, I guess you have unreliable data. You also have data that uh, that may not be like collected correctly, things like that. And then, blah, 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 blah. Where would you start? Where if someone's listening in and they've got a Shopify store, or they've got some basic Google Analytics set up, how would you walk through a client like that in terms of things that they should be thinking about right now?
Yes, yeah, yeah. I do quite a few work with startups, and I think startups and small business are
Sure.
can be very synonymous. Startups might just be a fancier word. I would say, I would start by figuring out what's there already. Mm-hmm. I think by far and large for small businesses, they don't have to, and they shouldn't spend a lot of time setting up fancy tools, which I think is an issue I see with very small companies. They want to be like the big guys. Right. So they create a stack that's very complex, but they only have a very small amount of data. E-commerce is interesting to me because you can actually have a lot of data out of the box, as you mentioned, which is good and bad. But Shopify gives you a lot of data out of the box. Yeah, you could easily connect that with Google Analytics and get even more data. So you have something there. So figuring out what's there already, and then try to find the low-hanging fruit. So in this case, we might be looking at, let's say, your existing customer base, and trying to figure out who are the best customers. Let's say, who are the top 10% or the bottom 10%, who's buying more than others. And this can be done with small amounts of data. You don't need to be looking at 1 million customers. You could be looking at 500 or maybe a few hundred, and try to find the attributes that make up these best customers. Maybe they happen to be female, of a certain age range, or even a certain country, or certain location, or maybe certain products. Mm-hmm. So a lot of the, sort of the 80-20 analysis that you might hear can be done with small amounts of data. Based on that, so, start figure out where you are, find some of the low-hanging fruit, the top customers, bottom customers, or the whales, as sometimes they might get called in e-commerce. And then I would figure out the top issues in the site. Mm-hmm. So this might be conversion issues, where people are again hung up, maybe technical issues, and work through those issues. Not to do a full website redesign, which might be.
But how would you find those issues? So let's just walk through what you just said. I think that's really important, right? So firstly, you're saying look at the customers and try to segment them, right? Like find the really high spenders, maybe these segments, and then I guess where you're going with this is find the customers that are the most valuable to you, and then try to see how I can make the next segment be more like them, right? Like what can I do in the site, right? I guess that's where you're going with it. So now I've got this list. So I know, I don't know, A, B, C, D, E are my quote unquote whales, and they spend a lot of money with me. What do I do with that information?
Yeah. So now that information could be used in a few different ways. It could be a source for, let's say, a Facebook marketing retargeting audience for your ads. If you're running ads, it could be a research source where you're not gonna try to find other marketing sources that are full of those customers. And of course, it could be a source for further communication. So being able to send email communication,
Yeah.
ongoing, can be sent to those customers to encourage them to keep buying, and maybe even as a fourth option, as a way to develop new products. So maybe you're thinking of coming up with new products or subscriptions. Those are probably going to be the customers you actually want to get feedback from, because those are the ones you want them to buy and you want more of them.
Absolutely. I mean, just coming back to your third point, one of the things I was thinking about when you said look at problems in your site, I guess you could also email them and say, hey, like, was there something you didn't like about our site that you want us to improve, right? Is there any other thing that you've seen people do to it? The reason I'm going with this is that I think this is a topic that's near and dear to a lot of small business e-commerce owners. They're constantly trying to see, how do I make my site better?
Yeah.
How do I make it convert better? So, I think talking to the whales, so to speak, is a great point. Have you seen any other tactics where people get some good advice on how to improve things?
Yeah, yeah, and this can be an endless rabbit hole, right? Because you could be
Right.
improving things forever, and you maybe get to the point of that Google story where you're trying different shades of blue. But I think for smaller
Basically, like, well
businesses,
done if you're getting to that point, right?
yeah, 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 that's you're at a different level. But really, I think and I have a few e-commerce clients.
Yeah.
Probably the most useful report that we have is really just a funnel, right?
Mhm.
And we're able to see the drop off from step to step, from viewing the product to adding to cart and checking out and so on. And we're just working through where the biggest drop offs. Is it at the initial stages, from
Amazing.
viewing the product to that, or is it maybe down the funnel when they're going to add the credit cards? And then working through some of the best practices, a secure site, a consistent experience, things like that. But we're still focused on the funnel itself, and that's what's guiding us. That's,
Right.
I think, what the bulk of the issues are. Eventually, again, you can go and find more specific things on how you display products and how you provide social proof and things like that. But the funnel is where I've seen that most of my e-commerce clients focus. And again, this might come from Google Analytics or Shopify, but it just shows you how users are moving through that drop off, and then what things maybe you can insert, right? Maybe you have retargeting for people who drop off halfway through the funnel, or if you ever heard of like cart abandonment, this is
Yeah.
roughly what they come in, right?
Yeah, like I had another, like, in a previous episode, I guess mentioned respect the funnel, and I think that was a good quote, because um, and just coming back to this, like, if anyone listening in right now, if you've got an e-commerce store, um, that's a really great way to start, because it's, I guess, with the funnel, it's something which you can show to anybody and they would get it. It's not some
Yeah.
fancy report or anything like that. It's literally just telling you, like, do you segment the funnel, or are there any, like, major steps that, like, you define? So for instance, how do you think of the funnel? Like, is it like homepage, category page, product page? Is it that detailed, or is it like landing page to cart to, how do you structure it normally?
Yeah, yeah, and yeah, I think segmenting is critical. You had a example earlier about the average conversion rate and going down from month to month.
Yeah.
There's something, there's a phrase out there which I can't remember who said this. Averages lie, but segments don't. So I think even a
I like
funnel
that.
as a whole
Mhm.
can lie, because it's just the average of the entire site.
Yeah.
So yes, in our case, we want to segment as much as possible, and really we're looking for outliers. So if your average conversion rate in the funnel is 2%, we want to see any segment that's doing better than that.
Mm.
So landing pages, marketing sources like marketing campaign sources, technology. Is there a difference between desktop, mobile, and tablet the same? Geographic might be relevant depending on who you serve and where you go. Maybe product type, and so on. There's probably maybe about 5 or 6 major segments that we can start to look at,
Right.
and try to figure out where can we focus, right? Let's say you discover that your mobile conversion rate sucks compared to your desktop.
Sure.
That can be a bit tricky. That could be a major project to make sure your website is mobile friendly, if it's not already. So we may actually leave that behind and realize that we can make some improvements to our landing page. which might be easier to do. So we're also trying to gauge what's the difficulty of tackling a problem, and where can we make those big changes,
So I've
especially
seen
yeah.
So I've seen people do this thing where, because what you're really getting at is some kind of scoring prioritization, right? So
Yes.
what you're essentially saying is that, hey, like go get your funnel, segment it, look for the outliers, and find. I mean, if it's 2%, which ones are 0.1% and which ones are 4%, right? Like where are the crazy
Yeah.
ones? Um, and so I've seen people do this thing where they see this data and then they list all kinds of projects that they can do, like for instance, make the mobile thing friendly, and then they score it based on like business value and like how difficult it is to do. Is that why you're getting at here?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, yeah. You might have seen frameworks like ICE, I think impact, confidence, and uh, difficulty, how difficult it is.
Mm-hmm.
But it's just effectively a way to prioritize. Yeah, to prioritize how difficult is this change? Are we talking
Mm-hmm.
about a copy change or a complete redesign? Uh, what kind of impact could we really get? There's only so much you can improve certain aspects. So if you look at benchmarks, or sort of the best benchmarks in the industry, how much high could you be, compared to where you are, and then from there be able to prioritize. What's tricky about this, this is effectively where A/B testing comes in, and having a experimentation framework. I find most businesses of all sizes can run A/B tests. It's getting easier than ever to run A/B tests, but they really struggle with this prioritization aspect of things, and they sort of do it based on what they think
Is most
might
important.
work, but it's all kind of very anecdote driven.
Right. And one of the things I guess is important when you're doing this prioritization is that you don't do it alone, right? Like you get your team together, because your marketing guy, like everybody has their own biases. So if
Yeah,
you're like, I find, for instance, personally, I have this problem. So I'm the CTO of DataQ. So whenever I look at sort of like, 'cause we do very similar things, we're always trying to see how to improve the product. And I find that I'm constantly looking at technical ways to solve it, because that's where I approach it. Whereas my co-founder has a different bias. So I find like when I do this prioritization exercise, it's much better for me to sit with her and do it together, where then the score is like a little bit of a negotiation. It takes time,
yeah,
but at least, and the other thing which I find is really useful with that is that you get a much better buy-in to do it, because it doesn't matter how great your idea is, that if people don't believe that it's important, then it doesn't get done, right?
yeah, exactly. And you could, as a small team, you could start simple. You could just get everyone to rank each idea on a score of 1 to 10 on how impactful they think they'll be and how long they'll take and so on. And then you average out the score, and you find the ones that, on average, the team seems to decide as much as possible. That adds some democracy to the process.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I think at some companies, or even most companies, the CEO will still have sort of like a final say on what
Yeah.
actually gets to run, but at least you can get a sense of what the engineering team person or team feels like, or what the marketing person feels like, and then from there come up with your next 2 or 3 ideas that you want to work on.
Yeah, and hopefully you find something which you didn't consider, or like I was reading something. I don't even know if this is true, but it makes sense that it's true. Apparently, Amazon's one-click checkout idea came from an engineer. It wasn't from Jeff Bezos,
Oh,
and
yeah,
that's like arguably made them a ton of money.
yeah,
So yeah, I think. I guess it comes down to the organization on how democratic you want to be, because the more democratic you are, where you fan out everything, the process does get a lot slower. So I guess you want to find that right balance. And I guess it doesn't help that everyone's sort of at home right now. So, as many people as you can get on a Zoom call, I guess.
yeah, exactly. Yeah,
So before we move on to like, I really, really want to get into A/B testing and things like statistical significance. But one topic which I think is sort of isn't really addressed very much is that you have this huge segment of businesses that literally like have no data, who have just started, or they've been in business for a while, but something like, I think like Shopify has, I think, over 1 million websites, but I bet a fair chunk of them, especially now with a 90-day free trial, have just started. Um, so then everything which we've just talked about doesn't really help, right? Because they don't have orders, they don't have. Would you say in this instance where you don't have quote unquote enough data that you shouldn't look at data at all and you should just go with your gut and then test how it goes? Like, what would you advise someone in that situation?
It really becomes about the customer. So Paul Graham from Y Combinator had a great essay for software companies, but really applies in this case, about doing things that don't scale.
Mm-hmm.
And I find for startups or small businesses who are just getting started, what that means when it comes to data is you probably do not have a funnel, right? If your funnel only has 10 people and you can see that 5 of them drop in step 5, maybe that's a problem, maybe not. Like the numbers are still too low to really make strong decisions on it. But what you can do is look at the individual users. So in this case, you're really becoming very familiar with John Smith. And where did John Smith come from? How did John Smith hear about your site? What products did he or she buy? Is there, are they using those products? Are they happy with them? That kind of thing. And what's great is at this stage, you can actually be very familiar with, your first 100 customers, maybe your first few hundred customers. Like, yeah, you can actually know who they are and have a pretty clear picture about that person.
Yeah.
And how you fit into their life in a smaller, big way. And eventually you will not be able to do this, right? You'll have thousands of customers and you cannot keep track of individuals. But now you can. And what that means is what you know about your individual customers would then just shape everything else you do, because you'll know that you'll be marketing to John Smith and what this person cares about. So that gives you some ideas as to what products to get or what marketing campaigns to send or what to say. And I think that's really beneficial, but it might not be as sexy, as looking at a funnel and slicing it and doing all this kind of analysis, but it can still be very impactful, right? To be very, very aware about who your customer is.
No, I think that the reason I want to get into this topic is because I find that there's so much advice out there that I almost feel like it's less about the actual advice and more about letting people know at what stage what advice applies to them.
Yeah.
Because I see this, I mean, I'm a member of quite a few e-commerce groups, and a very common question I see is, hey guys, I ran a Facebook ad campaign. I got, 1,000 views, 2,000 views, and nobody bought anything. Can somebody help me? Like, what do I have to do? And exactly, right? So like someone in that situation should not be thinking about a funnel at all. They should be thinking about, okay, like I just tried Facebook. Let's try another ad somewhere else and see if that worked better. And then go from there, like get your first customer and then talk to that customer. And exactly what you said, I think that was great. And then once you're getting enough customers and you can start scaling that, then you move on to maybe the funnel, where now you're looking to really optimize. And then once you've got enough data in your funnel, now you get to segment. And it seems like there's sort of this maturity curve. And I guess anybody listening in right now, you should really try to figure out where you are on this curve so that you can take the advice that best fits you.
Yeah. Yeah. And it might not sound sophisticated to say, just literally talk to your customer, talk to your 10 customers and get on the phone call or talk by email. But, I don't know if you've seen there's a reality TV show, Undercover Boss or something.
Yeah, I've heard of it. I haven't seen an episode. I saw like a Key and Peele version of it. Go ahead.
Yeah. It's bigger companies and the CEO becomes, goes down into like the front lines to talk to customers.
Yeah.
But it turns out to be a big issue for really large companies. They eventually get so large that they're really disconnected from who the customer actually is, and they just have no idea what this person actually cares about. So a small business that just started doesn't have that problem because they can actually keep track of all the customers. And I think that could probably be, what you do for your first maybe couple hundred customers.
Mm-hmm.
And that tells you, that'll probably give you the ideas that you need as to where to go find them, how to talk to them, and what will make them buy.
Right. I mean, you just reminded me of this Zappos story where every time they hired someone, regardless of their position, they had to go work at the warehouse and actually sell the shoes for I don't know how long. And I thought that was like a so I guess what you're saying is that everyone who's starting out now a small business, you already have that luxury because there's no one between you and the customer, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think that's a very nice way of putting it. Very positive.
And even,
So go ahead.
sorry, I was going to say with one point, even companies who have data, it might be starting maybe in the middle of their
Mhm.
journey,
Mhm.
but maybe they never did this. Um, it's one of the things I always strive for them to do more, to collect more qualitative data, because I think it's easy to fall prey and look at just data points and look at,
Mm.
this data points are moving through a funnel and then you see them drop off. So you're making some decisions, but do you really know who's behind those data points and what, who they are roughly in demographics and behavioral attributes? And that tends to also complete the story. So it's not just this funnel, it's women 25 to 34 who care about these things who are going for the funnel. And I think that provides a much more richer understanding of the data.
Yeah, I guess would you say that it's important to have this balance where you don't do too much quantitative or too much qualitative, but you try to sort of. So I guess it's sort of like we talked about this at the start of the conversation, where you really need to think of some kind of process, I guess, right? So maybe it's an email where after they buy something, you automatically send them a quick survey where they get to write in some qualitative feedback, but at the same time you're doing a quantitative analysis as well so that you can spot issues.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's actually what you mentioned is how I would really like to do qualitative data. You can do
Mm-hmm.
it on a one-off. You run a survey, you design the survey. That's fine. But I also think it's really powerful to have those automated hooks. So yeah, when someone purchases, when someone returns something, maybe when someone falls off, maybe they add to cart but then they fall off. All this kind of points throughout the journey. Having an automated email or a survey or for a way to provide feedback. And in reality, you're probably not going to see this data on a regular basis, but when you need it, it will be there. So when you say, why do people buy our products? Do we know? You can go back and look at, 100 responses from the past 30 days or whatever it might be, and that you're able to access it. I think that's a great way to balance out the quantitative obsession that can take place.
Yeah, I mean, especially, I mean, I've been in a situation quite a few times where if you didn't automate it and you get this data coming in, chances are that when you're having the problem and you're trying to solve it, you don't have enough data at hand to do it. So now you have to not do anything and try to collect some data to make the decision, which makes things even worse. So you might as well like take the time, and especially if you're stuck at home in quarantine and
Yeah.
things have slowed down, I guess this is something anyone should already start working on, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So, all right. So let's move on to sort of the more complex topics. It's sort of the stuff which I'm pretty excited about. So let's say we've got a company, they're getting some decent sales every month, and they've been reading a lot about A/B testing and things like this. Um, like I personally find that this idea of A/B testing has been abused so much that everybody thinks that it's like this golden panacea. Like for instance, one of the biggest problems I see is this problem of statistical significance. Like I think people don't fully can you just walk us through how you explain A/B testing to your clients so that
Yeah.
like what's your sort of quick 101 on it?
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, I find most companies understand what A/B testing will be. They'll have two variations of a page or a part of a page. So we don't spend too much time there. What I really want them to do, and not all of them do it perfectly, is to just have a consistent process. So I tell them, hey, you're gonna have tons of ideas. There's gonna be no lack of ideas from yourself, from your CEO, from your team. Don't worry, you'll have lots of ideas. Find a way to prioritize them and give them different options. Here is a model where you have like multiple columns, maybe based on effort or impact, or maybe just a very simple one like we spoke before, like let's just rank each idea on a scale of 1 to 10 and get 4 or 5 people to do it. But just have a way to prioritize them
Right.
based on the team effort. And then when you take let's say the next idea,
Mhm.
runs run through some basic statistical significance. Maybe we don't call it that, but just say let's run through what what we want people, or how many people we want us to see this.
Explain statistical significance.
Statistical significance really just means that a change that was seen, let's say a landing page that performed better, uh, the improvement, let's say landing page A, the original, the control as it gets called, converts at 10%, and then landing page B converts at 15%. That difference, between 10 and 5, is where the significance comes from. So in simple terms, the larger the change, so if landing page B converted at 45%, it's a big change, you would need less people to be able to be significant. But the smaller the change, the more people you need. So then there's calculators online, and A/B testing tools will do this for you. It just gives you a number, up to 100%. And in the industry, anything about 95 tends to be good. So if if Optimizely or WVO tells you that your landing page B converted at a 95% significance, it's roughly telling you that the change that they saw and the number of people that saw it is significant, and it's not just random. Because and a lot of times you can just run something and be random because of random cases, the time of day, the day of the week, and so on. But it's not random. That's what statistical significance is trying to help you understand, that this was deliberate, and it's something that would hold in theory. That's at least what the math is trying to tell us.
Yeah, and I think this is sort of this topic which coming back to the very first thing we talked about in terms of data literacy. That's so important, right? Like a very practical example I had was we were running tests, and the thing is that in e-commerce, people don't like. There's an average order value, but you have some people who buy a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
So if I had an experiment where, like, I think in this particular example, there was a guy from a hotel who made this monstrous order, right? So you're running an A/B test, and on B, this person from the hotel comes in and buys stuff which is like at least 50x the average amount. So now suddenly, no matter what A does, B is just always amazing. But so then I got into this topic where I was like, no, but it doesn't mean B is that great because we don't have enough people going through. So I like how you put that. So when we're coming down to this, what's the metric that you usually talk to customers about to say that, okay, like you are ready to do A/B test? Like, are you looking at like page views per month, or do you say, you know what, it's fine at any stage, but it just takes more time? How do you have that conversation with clients, the smaller ones especially?
Yeah. Of course, you could run a test, and if you have all the time in the world, you could run it for 6 months and get there eventually. Get to that significance. But most companies will not. I think most companies will not run anything longer than 1 month at most. I think it's just almost like a mental struggle for them to think beyond that. So we're talking about a month timeline. So really, what I tell them is, hey, you'll be ready when let's say you have 2 things you want to test, the control versus like variation A or whatever.
Yeah.
The moment you're able to get a few hundred conversions on each one within that month is when you're ready. And then they'll say, okay, well, we're trying to test for sales. So that means that, each of those things we want to test, it needs to get a few hundred conversions. And then they can look at their sales numbers and then make some, rough math to see if they're ready or not. That's the guidance. Of course, like I'm sure you have, I've seen companies run A/B tests and get 20 sales on each of their variations. And then they'd be like, it looks like variation B is much better because there were 22 sales versus 20 sales. I'm like, this isn't it.
No,
it doesn't make sense. Yeah. So yeah, those are the rough guidance, a few hundred conversions on each variation, be able to run it for at least a couple of weeks to try to get some of the seasonality out of it. Of course, there's maybe larger seasonality in the year, but let's not get into that. and then be able to prioritize it.
So, I mean, I know, for instance, Google Optimize is a pretty friendly. I mean, there's obviously much more expensive tools like Optimizely, but I think Google Optimize is free,
Yes.
and it's
Yep.
pretty easy to set up. Are there any other tools that you've seen, or maybe it's just Google Optimize, that you could recommend to a small business e-commerce owner who's thinking, "Hey, I've heard about this A/B testing stuff. How do I get started?"
Yeah. No, I think Google Optimize is fantastic. It is free. I think you're limited to 3 active tests or 5 active tests at any given time, or like active slots. So it's fantastic. It easily integrates with Google Analytics, which then could probably easily integrate with Shopify. So
Hmm.
you're able to get your e-commerce data into Google Analytics and then into Google Optimize. So that's a really popular stack, I think, for any business that's testing on web.
And what have you seen like impactful A/B tests, right? Because I think conceptually, like you said, it's pretty intuitive. I have version A, version B. I just want to see which one's better, and then if B is better, I'm going to stick with B, and now test it against the new one. But I guess there's a million areas that you can apply it to, right? So in like with the clients you work with, what are the areas that you found are typically like good places to start with? Like what have they done which has been useful?
Yeah, yeah. I find it helpful to start in the areas where we're asking for the most commitment. Um,
Okay.
so let's say the credit card area tends to be a high commitment area. It's at that point where you're really, someone can go through, add products, and be like, that looks amazing. I want that. I want this. Yes, I'll do this. Add to cart. But when the credit card comes out, I think is when it really starts to become real.
Mm.
Um, so the credit card portion, making sure that that part is correct. It's interesting, because credit cards are very common, at least in US and Canada. But I still see e-commerce stores that they sort of miss all the basic cues. So you look at
Right.
Amazon and you have all the social proof, the security, all the logos and so on, the way the credit cards get validated, all that kind of stuff. But I find a lot of, especially new e-commerce businesses, seem to miss that a little bit.
Mm.
Using Shopify can really help you because they'll give you some of those fundamentals. But if you're not with a Shopify, maybe you build your own platform, you want to make sure that you have your basics there. So commitment will be one. The second one is consistency. Same thing. I've seen some e-commerce flows that, for example, they don't show all the pricing upfront.
Mm.
So they might not show the shipping or the taxes or some random duty fees. So everything's fine. The user's like, oh yeah, I want this. It's gonna cost this much. I get that. And then boom, they're hit with, 20, 30% of fees in the checkout portion. So being able to be consistent.
But how would you A/B test that? Are you saying you A/B test consistency versus inconsistency, or like how does that relate to A/B testing?
You A/B test it by showing some of the messaging upfront.
Okay.
So showing some of the expectation on what the shipping might be, maybe a shipping estimate or maybe a message that would show that.
Right. Got it.
And I'm not sure how much you've seen this, but I've seen also e-commerce companies that completely hide the price. So they actually build more of a like a funnel, but the price is actually hidden all the way at the end. So you
Mm.
go through, you select your product, you customize it, and you don't actually get the price at the very end. That's, I think, also an element of consistency where you're not really sure what's going to happen until you really get to the end. So they see huge drop offs at the very end, which is maybe a
Makes
little bit more
sense.
rare. Yeah.
Right. Right. Okay. And I guess when you run these experiments, I think it's very important to remember what you said before, right? Which is have this goal in mind. Maybe it's like hundreds of conversions. So
Yeah.
if you're just starting out, it's going to take some time. Like let it go. Would you recommend that? I think this is sort of like this mantra that I've seen a lot where people say always test, even when you don't have like say you do this test which you mentioned, like would you recommend that they wait, or would you just have this list of tests and they just keep on going all the time so that the site is constantly A/B testing?
So, yeah, that's tough. I think you can end up being swung, especially if you don't have as much traffic. What you'll probably realize is then you need to make bigger tests. right?
Mm.
So the test of the color button makes no sense. So you have to test the entire landing page redesign to sort of make it worth it for your one test a month, let's say, if that's what you're limited to. I don't know. I don't know if I agree to always be testing. I think it can be a distraction because I think we might end up in a similar example of what you mentioned before, where that user is running Facebook traffic left and right, but getting no sales, and maybe he or she is testing landing page or so on, but what they really need is just to talk to their customers. They like literally have no idea who the customer is, so they're really trying to go through the hardest route, like through the
Right.
anonymized data point, let the software figure out who the customer is. So I think that there's an element of balance there, of always be running tests. Yeah.
Sure. And I guess the other point to make here is that there is a level where you do have to trust your gut, right? Because if you did your homework and you know your customers, it could be that the data that you've collected is not enough to tell you that, like, there's no need to panic. Like, maybe the conversions aren't coming because of some other reason. So you
Yeah.
can test it, but doesn't mean that, like, say you see a very low conversion rate, that suddenly like your whole business is wrong.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And it's tough to say, but for some businesses with actual seasonality, you might actually not see that seasonality until you actually go through a season. So you
Yeah.
might happen to be in a, I don't know, summer, which might be low season for you, but you don't know that because it's your first summer.
Mm-hmm.
So you're running your head against the wall and you're just not making progress. For my business, a low season for me in consulting is typically like August. Most people are gone for vacation with their
Right.
kids. It's a very slow time. And I remember the first 2-3 years of my business, I really like bumped my head against the wall. I'd be like, it's August. It's not going to be slow. Like, it doesn't matter what. Like, I'm going to call people. It doesn't matter where they are.
Right.
And then by the fourth and fifth year, I'm like, it's August. I'll take time off. Because
Right.
it's,
Perfect.
because why am I trying to reach people that are not in the office? So I think there's an element of that you won't know
Yeah.
the seasonality until you actually go see it.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, you don't want to be trying to run the numbers on something that's just out of your control.
Yeah, and I guess that's why these kind of conversations to people listening in can be so confusing, right? Because essentially, you're saying trust the data, but don't trust it too much.
Yeah.
And honestly, I think it's very hard to give anybody like a clear answer on this. And I really think it comes back to your point about what Paul Graham said. The better you know your customer, the more you know whether the data looks right or not. Like, I think if you don't know your customer at all, then you are far more likely to be misled by data. Would you agree?
Yes. Yeah. And one of the things I tell clients is don't assume that gut feeling is bad, data is good. Like this like black and white spectrum that we live in. I think the spectrum is much more gray, right?
Yeah.
I think good data and having good data will actually help inform your gut feeling and what
Mm-hmm.
feels right.
Mm-hmm.
And then maybe sometimes you'll be wrong, and then the data will correct it. They'll tell
Mm-hmm.
you, "Oh, you were wrong," and it just get better at decision making with data. Just like we have qualitative data, to sort of balance out the quantitative. So there's no, it's not about just being 100% data driven, no qualitative, no gut feeling, no anecdotes. It's more about having that balance
Mm-hmm.
and supporting you. Yeah.
One of the so we talked quite a bit about performance and using data to improve certain objectives, but another area that I think is very interesting, especially now with COVID, is this idea of using data for product discovery or basically improving your product portfolio, right?
Yeah.
I was reading through your blog and you mentioned things like how Netflix came up with House of Cards because they found that Kevin Spacey was really famous and political stuff was
Yeah.
useful. And I was thinking how that could be related to COVID, because what we've seen, at least with this current situation, I'm not sure how long it's going to last, but it's really shifted demand to a few industries, and these guys are having record sales. Like, it's even higher than, like, it's like a Cyber Monday every week if you're doing
Yeah.
groceries or home equipment. And then you've got like other industries on the other end of the scale, like travel, where it's like almost zero. So I guess it's a good time for somebody in the middle to try to look at the data to see like, hey, like how much has demand for my product shifted, and could I be doing new products from the data I've collected, or could I be readjusting messaging on my existing products to fit what people are thinking about right now. Have you seen anything like that with your clients? And like, how would you like? What would you say to that? To talk someone through someone who's thinking about this.
Yeah, yeah. I think that it's a great question because it ties some of the things we have talked about. So we have our customers, right? And we sort of know who our customers are. And we want to know who they are.
Hmm.
And we can then tie that to the more global trends that we're seeing. I had a customer who they work with gyms in Dubai and Hong Kong. And of course, gyms are closed.
Hmm.
Dubai is on a lockdown. So they're actually moving to online, as a lot of gyms are. So they took their customers and they took the trend of there's way more people willing to take online gym classes, which
Hmm.
wasn't very common really before, not live in the same way. And they're able to now create a product or a service around that. So I think it's the same thing. You know, you have
Awesome.
you have your customers, and you might be saying, uh, based on those customers, how are they changing? Let's
Hmm.
say we could probably assume some things. You know, we could assume they're going to be spending more time on social media, or they're going to be spending more time at home, at least now, or they have more disposable income because their expenses went down on,
Right.
you know, eating out and all the stuff, and they just want to get entertainment while they're stuck at home. So be able to tie your customers to the global trends, I think is where some of the interesting opportunities can come for new product creation uh, for now and the next 6 to 12 months as we see some of these trends become more standard.
Yeah, and I think the bigger companies have been doing this all the time, even pre-COVID. So it's not like this is something which you need to be thinking about only because of the current situation. I guess it's become more urgent, but it's not like picking up these skills is going to be thrown away right after we're entering another normal.
Yeah, exactly. You know, and you can it become really interesting when you really think about it, right? You think how many more people are going to be delivering stuff, whether for Uber Eats or Skip the Dishes or Amazon or Walmart. So if you have any products that could fit that demographic, you know,
Hmm.
delivery drivers, that's probably pretty good. You're about to see a bump in that, or maybe people work in warehouses or anything to do with online content, video, audio, social media. Of course, will continue to grow. So it's all these trends that might seem small, but depending on your industry, could be pretty big. Online gyms, all that kind of stuff. So,
Yeah, I guess it's time to get that creative juices flowing, and um, I mean, honestly, like it's a tragedy right now. What's going on from the health perspective? But one of the things I'm seeing is people really coming together and being really creative and
yeah.
really trying to fight this sort of darkness, if you will, with really good ideas, and that's one of the at least the heartwarming things which I'm seeing right now, especially in the business community with small business. And I guess if for everyone listening in, this has been some really solid advice from you, Ruben. Thank you so much. How would you like, maybe just to wrap this up, like what are sort of the key takeaways for you for a small business e-commerce owner listening in, of what they should be thinking about and doing right now?
Yeah, yeah. A lot of themes that we talked about, I think, focus on the customer. You know, there's always, I think, room for talking to customers on the phone, email, surveys. There's always something you can learn, even now as things are changing very quickly. Then we talk a lot about data. Data is great, but try to find that balance in the data, not just the quantitative and the qualitative, but even how you use data and how you make gut feeling decisions. So
Hmm.
there's not a black and white; it's really a gray, and it all supports each other. And I think when in the very last point, you know, is trying to be on the offensive. So it's tough times, right? And we've seen spending drop on networks and entire industries be halted. So not everyone's doing well, not everyone's booming, but there is opportunities, right? And I think if you're able to go the offensive and start to think forward and think what's changing, how can I adapt, what can I release, what can I create, there's going to be interesting things that small businesses can tackle over the next 6 or 12 months.
Great advice. I especially love how positive it is, like being on the offensive rather than just sitting back and wondering, hey, why is this happening? There's stuff people are doing about it, and you could be one of them too.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. Hey, like I'm sure people are going to have more questions for you. It's been really, really good advice, and I know for sure this is a topic that a lot of e-commerce owners really want to know more about. So, how can listeners get in touch with you?
Yeah, I write and create a lot of resources, and they can be found at practicoanalytics.com. That's where you'll find blog posts and templates and videos and a bunch of other stuff. That would be the best place.
Awesome. Hey, Ruben, it was great having you on the show, man.
Perfect. Yeah, likewise. Thanks for having me.
Bye.